majority of us. He and I were here when we laid the first stones along with Bob, long time. So let me share with you all of his accomplishments. David Drumm became a licensed Unity teacher in 1996 when he was 12 and has taught over 26 different Unity courses. He is a practicing attorney in the DFW area for over 40 years. He's active in the Dallas Philosophers Forum with the Hatton W. Sumner's Foundation, which promotes civic education and participation. He is a speaker and author of 2 legal books. He has previously served on the board at Unity of Dallas for many years. He's a former board president. I got to work on the board when David was president. Sometimes we got home at midnight, but we accomplished a lot. David became a board member of Unity Worldwide Ministries this year. We are blessed to have David here today. Please welcome David Drumm.
Thank you, Ann, for the kind introduction, and good morning, everyone. I believe in living in the question, and so my talk title is a question. And that question is, can we take the Bible seriously? I also believe that the first place to start with any question is our personal lived experience, so I'm going to start with mine. I brought with me an old friend. You may not even be able to tell, but this is a Bible. You can probably tell because of the paper and kind of the rose-colored edges of the pages. For some reason, we don't do that with other books. But this is not the prettiest Bible in the world. It's seen better days. It lost its cover somewhere along the way. And it's not even the very first Bible I had, because I have a memory of on the headboard of the bed, there was like a little white Bible. I think it was just the New Testament that was given to me by St. Paul Hospital when I was born, but it just stayed on the shelf there. You know, it was just kind of there, and but I never was really, driven to kind of crack the cover and figure out what was in it. But this particular Bible has an inscription in it that reminds me that it was presented to David Drumm by the First Christian Church of Richardson, Texas, on May the 30th, 1965. And the occasion was my graduation from 3rd grade Sunday school class. And I think they considered that, through 3 grades, you sort of just went to Sunday school and heard people tell you stories from the Bible, but maybe going into 4th grade, you could start reading the Bible yourself. And so I was intrigued by this, and so I set out. I was always kind of a good student. I set out to pick this up and read it cover to cover. I didn't make it quite all the way, but I made it a fair way into it. And I started, of course, with Genesis. And you read in Genesis about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and the serpent and Adam and Eve being cast out of the Garden of Eden. And then you read about Adam and Eve had 2 sons, Cain and Abel. And Cain got jealous of Abel because he seemed to be the favored child, and murdered Abel. And then he had this crisis of fear, and he has a conversation with God, and he said, God, I've just done something bad. I'm worried that someone's going to do harm to me. And God said, oh, don't worry, Cain. I've got you. If anybody does anything to you, I'll avenge you 7-fold. And just to make that clear, I'm going to put a mark on you so everybody will know you're under God's protection. And then it says, and Cain went east of Eden and found a wife. Okay, now I was only about 10 years old, but I paused at that point, and some questions began to arise. One was, exactly where did Cain find his wife? There were 4 people on the planet, and one of them's been murdered, so there's now 3 people on the planet. where did this wife come from? And then exactly who was Cain afraid might do him harm? You know, he had been cast out, he had been forced to leave his parents, and he had murdered his brother. So exactly who did he think was going to do him harm? And so, you know, I began to kind of scratch my head about these things. And then you go in a little bit further, and it tells how Methuselah lived to be 969 years old. And I'm thinking, was medicine really that much more advanced back then? You know, I mean, doctors can't keep us alive for 969 years. And at the risk of beating a dead horse, let me give you a couple more. There's a passage in the book of Joshua where the Israelites, God's favorite people, are having a battle, and they need a little bit more daylight hours to completely rout their enemy in the battle. So God commands the sun to stand still, and so they get some more daylight, and they're able to completely rout their enemies in battle. Well, the problem with that is that daylight hours are not a function of whether the sun is moving or not. They're a function of the rotation of the earth on its axis on a 24-hour cycle. And so whoever wrote this didn't really understand the way the solar system worked. And then this one's one of my favorites. Sometimes there's more than one account of an event in the Bible, and there's books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles and books of 1st and 2nd Kings cover some of the same events. And in the King's version, King David was instructed by God to conduct a census of Israel and to number the people. And in the account by Chronicles, they're talking about the same census. It was Satan that instructed David to conduct that census. Now, obviously, those two authors had different opinions about whether the census was a good idea or not. But would anybody who thinks the Bible is to be taken literally think that we should consider God and Satan the same thing? Because they are the same thing if you conflate these two stories. But perhaps, I mean, there are people that say, well, okay, you can't really take the Bible literally when it's talking about history, but when it's talking about morals or when it's talking about articles of faith, you know, we can take it seriously about that. So let's look at morals first. And this is probably the only passage I'm going to read instead of paraphrase, but I kind of want to give you the flavor of this. So, you know, there are people that would say the moral commandments in the Bible are from God's mouth to our ears, that they are God telling us what to do, and we better follow these commandments or else. You know, a very, very prescriptive idea. But people who say that are always a little bit selective about which commandments they think should be followed and which commandments should not. And here's one you don't hear about so much. In Deuteronomy 21, starting with chapter 18, God is laying down the law to Moses, and this is part of it. He says, "If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and though they chastise him, will not give heed to them, then his father and his mother shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of his city at the gate of the place where he lives. And they shall say to the elders of his city, 'This our son is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard.' Then all the men of the city shall stone him to death with stones, so you shall purge the evil from your midst, and all Israel shall hear and fear." Well, as a son who was sometimes stubborn and rebellious, I was glad that this one was not taken so literally. You turn to the next chapter of Deuteronomy, and there's a stern commandment not to wear clothing that is mixed of linen and wool. And by extension, that means don't wear any blended fabrics. So I want to ask you all, have you atoned for your sins with blended fabrics? Okay, but what about articles of faith? I mean, what could be more fundamental to the Christian tradition than the birth, crucifixion, and resurrection of Jesus? So let's look at those. As to the birth of Jesus, we have 4 canonical Gospels. Only 2 of them, Matthew and Luke, have anything to say about the birth of Jesus. And they differ. In Matthew, Jesus is born in Nazareth. In Jerusalem, he's born in Bethlehem. So there's a discrepancy in a basic kind of biological fact in that particular account. When you go to the crucifixion, you have 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that relate that the crucifixion happened after a Passover meal that Jesus celebrated with his disciples. But in the Gospel of John, the meal that Jesus shares with his disciple is not the Passover meal, but the meal on the eve of preparation, the eve before Passover Eve. And John did that because he liked the idea that when Jesus sheds his blood on the cross, that's the same time of the year that the blood of the lamb was put on the door of the house of the Israelites, and the angel of death came over and spared them. So he liked that chronology, and so he was not restricted by the facts to tell his story. Okay, let's go to the resurrection here. We have 4 different accounts of the resurrection, and I'll look at them in the order that these Gospels are believed to have been written. In Mark, it is related that on Easter morning, 3 women who are named visited the tomb, and they found the stone to the tomb had been rolled back, and that they went inside the tomb, and then in the tomb there was a young man in a white robe. And the young man in the white robe told them, "Jesus is risen, go tell the disciples." And then it says, despite that, they told no one. So they were disobedient. They told no one. It was they didn't follow the advice. Then we go to Matthew's story. Matthew names 2 women. We can't tell if they're 2 out of the 3 or not, because one was just another Mary. But in Matthew, the women actually see an angel roll back the stone instead of the stone being rolled back when they get there. And they go into the tomb, and they are told by that angel to go tell the disciples. And so this time they do decide they're going to follow the advice and go tell the disciples. But on the way out, they run into the risen Christ and have an encounter with the risen Christ. In the Gospel of Luke, it names 3 women that went to the tomb, and it said, and there were other women that went with them and not named. And they find there not 1 angel, but 2 angels. They go inside the tomb. They're told to tell the disciples. They go tell the disciples. Disciples don't believe them, because after all, these are just crazy women. But then the disciples later that day are on a journey to a town called Emmaus, and then the risen Christ appears to the disciples, and so they have an encounter there. In John, it's only Mary Magdalene that goes to the tomb by herself, and she doesn't go in the tomb, and all the other 3, they go inside. Mary sees the tomb rolled back, and she says, I better go tell someone. So she goes and tells Peter, and Peter and another unnamed disciple have a race to see who can get to the tomb first. And one of them looks in the tomb first, but another one runs in the tomb first or something, and they see the burial clothes there empty, and then they leave, and then only after they leave, Mary, she doesn't enter the tomb in the story, she looks in, she sees an angel. The 2 disciples didn't see the angel. I guess the angel materialized, after that. And the angel says, Jesus is not here. And then Jesus from behind Mary calls to her, and she turns around. She mistakes him for a gardener, but he says, don't you recognize me? Okay, now these are all very good stories, but I'm trained as a lawyer. I mean, if you have 4 witnesses on the stand that are relating this story, what do you conclude happened? I mean, how many women were at the tomb? Did Mary go in the tomb? Did she not go in the tomb? Did the women tell the disciples? Did the women not tell the disciples? It's kind of hard to pin down what the true facts are here. So with that, it's kind of tempting to say we can't take the Bible seriously because the only way to take the Bible seriously is to take it literally, and we can't take it literally because of these factors that I've related here, and so it's best just to kind of regard the Bible as some kind of irrelevant, antiquated, out-of-date historical relic. What that view and the literalist view have in common is that they both don't really understand how humans create purpose and meaning. Humans do not create purpose and meaning by dryly observing facts, like a videotape would reserve the facts, and you say, okay, this just happened, this just happened, this just happened. That's all I need to know is what happened. Just tell me what happened, and I'm happy. Human beings don't do that. Human beings interpret facts, and in interpreting facts, they give meaning and purpose to the facts. They create a narrative. And the way to take the Bible seriously, and I'm acknowledging here my indebtedness to Marcus Borg and Spong and Bishop Shelby Spong and other writers. This is not original with me, but I like to share these ideas. Is the way to take the Bible seriously is not to take it literally, but to look at it from a historical/metaphorical standpoint. Now, in the Unity curriculum, we have a set of Bible classes that are historical Bible. We have another set that are metaphysical. I think it's best to combine those two because I think they really should be looked at together and not a wall between them. So the historical Bible does tell us actually a fair amount about history once you sort of read it critically. I mean, it's not worthless as a historical document, but you have to use some discernment and some archaeology and some other sources and a few other things to figure out what the history is. And the history it tells is very interesting. If you look at the Hebrew Bible, there are different epochs of history that are all very interesting. The first epoch is kind of before the people of Israel differentiated themselves from the other Middle Eastern peoples. And you find a lot of this in the book of Genesis. And it contains answers to the kind of stories that a 3 or 4 year old child will ask and that people still ask. Stories like, how did I get here? Answer in Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. What is my nature? Answer in Genesis. You're created in the image and likeness of God. Why do we have to die? Answer in Genesis. Because Adam and Eve ate of the fruit of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil, and so we became conscious of our mortality. Why do people hurt each other? Because like Adam and Cain, we get jealous of each other, and when we get jealous, we do bad things to each other. Why do people speak different languages? Because people were arrogant and tried to build a tower all the way to heaven, and God undid that and made the people speak different languages so they couldn't communicate with each other. So that's kind of a primordial epic. But there also is a story that forged an identity of a community, and that story is in the next book after Genesis, Exodus, a story about the transformation of a people from being slaves in Egypt to being liberated and to having an intention that they eventually acted on to occupy a promised land and then going through wanderings in the wilderness for 40 years between liberation and the Promised Land. And it might have been just a band of 50 people. I mean, it tells you, if you take it literally, that like 2 million people made the exodus from Egypt to the Promised Land. That's impossible. It might have been 50 people. But the story that they made about that event and its significance became a bond that created a community. And eventually that community became 12 tribes that decided to affiliate with each other around this story of their identity. And then those tribes moved because the world was evolving around them, and they were going to be obliterated by other peoples if they didn't organize. They organized around chiefs, and so they went through a chiefdom phase that we find in the book of Judges, where a chief is someone that takes charge when there's a crisis, but then when the crisis is over, they kind of step back and relinquish their power. But chiefdoms tend to become kings, and we have a story in the book of Kings about how, and in the book of Samuel, about how the Israelites became a kingdom. And so we have a little bit of socio-cultural evolution there. It's one of the best accounts of socio-cultural evolution through stages you'll find. But then the kings sometimes abused their power, and so we have an epic of prophets. Prophets are messengers who feel the call of God, and they speak truth to power. They confront the king by saying, "You may be the king, but let me tell you what you did. Let me tell you a story. Let me challenge you with this." And that's a whole epic into itself. And then eventually, the Israelites were destroyed by the Assyrians and the Babylonians in two separate events, and carried off into exile in Babylon. But then they returned after 70 years. And when they returned, the Persians, who allowed them to return, would not let them have a king again, because they had to be under the Persian Empire. They couldn't have their own king. But the Persians did let them have priests. And so the priests became the governing body, and the priests built a temple. It's called the Second Temple. You can get a scholarly debate about whether the first temple was real or fictional, but in any event, the temple became the center, and the priest said to the people, "We know that there are things that you probably make you feel not okay. They make you feel dirty, unclean, impure, incomplete. We've got a way for you to feel complete. And originally it was, you need to make these sacrifices, you need to do this, but then gradually it evolved into you need to be kind to your neighbor, you need to be kind to widows and orphans, and then it graduated with the Pharisees to you need to be observant about how you live your everyday life. You need to be observant about how you prepare food. You need to be observant about what cycle of the day and so we have this wonderful historical story, but turning to the metaphorical side of the coin, and the historical metaphorical are two sides of one coin. They're not alternatives. Again, relying on Marcus Borg, he said there are three predominant themes in the Hebrew Bible. One is the theme about redemption from bondage. You get that in the Exodus story, that the people were in bondage, but they found liberation. That's a powerful story. The other story is that the people were exiled from their home, but eventually they returned from exile and came back home. That's a very powerful story. In fact, you find that story in the Lord of the Rings and Star Wars. I mean, it's one of the most powerful stories in the world. And the third story is the priestly story, that if you're not feeling okay with yourself, you can feel okay with yourself. You may have a different idea about what yields that transformation, but transformation is possible. There is transformation from a state where you're feeling yucky about yourself to a state where you're feeling very good about yourself. And those three metaphors are not what happened, but the meaning that these people made about what happened. I've been recently studying in another class an anthropologist named David Graeber, and he has a distinction that I had to kind of read it about 2 or 3 times before I got what he was saying, but he said there's a distinction between what actually happened and what it is that happened. You know, and the first time I thought, well, those are the same thing. And that what he's getting at is what actually happened. That's the fact without the interpretation. That's the videotape. You know, what it is that happened, and this is all that's real, is our experience of it. It's kind of the proverbial tree falling in the forest if nobody hears it. You know, I mean, if nobody hears the tree, then it doesn't really have any effect. It's only the experience we make of our encounter with the fact that gives it the meaning. And these three metaphors are powerful ways to give meaning to the facts, and they were for the people that wrote the Hebrew Bible. And then turning to the New Testament, and I talked about Christianity the last time I had this pulpit. Jesus of Nazareth, his main historical message is the kingdom of heaven is not a place you go in the afterlife. The kingdom of heaven is a present reality, and its reality is proportional to your ability to perceive it. It's as real as you can see it. But I think for him, he grew up in this culture of these metaphors. I think for him, this ability to perceive the kingdom of heaven, that was the liberation from bondage, that was the return from exile, and that was the sanctification, being made holy after you feel not okay and incomplete. So I think it combines all three ideas. And then when Jesus' followers carried on after he left the planet, they tended to confuse the messenger with the message, and they would say, well, Jesus was the one that liberated us from bondage. Jesus is the one that returns us from exile. Jesus is, in the New Testament, both the priest that conducts the sacrifice that makes us whole and the object of the sacrifice, the lamb that dies. Jesus is all of these things, but they're displacing the message onto the messenger. That's just human nature. It's still a powerful story. So what does this have to do with us? Well, when we tell, if you go to an icebreaker at a party or something, you might have an exercise where you go around and say, okay, everybody has 3 minutes to tell their story. And so you tell your story to people, and that's a good way to get to know people. But when people tell their story, they don't take the videotape approach. They don't say, well, I was born at such and such a hospital at 1:53 in the afternoon, and 36 hours later, my parents took me home from the hospital, and then I first walked when I was 1 year and 4 days old. That's not the story they tell. They tell the story that gives a purpose and a meaning to their life. And I think the way we take the Bible seriously is that we use the Bible as a source book for the themes that we can use to tell our own story. We can tell our own story as a liberation from bondage. We can tell our own story as a return from exile. We can tell our own story as a purification or a transformation. And I think that's the way to take the Bible seriously. We can also move from our personal story to a collective story. And this is where it gets really valuable. We talked about how the people of Israel formed a community, a collective community around these shared stories. And that's what any community needs to do. But the degree of difficulty is a lot higher because we've now got co-authors on the story. And so, we don't get to be the only storyteller. We've got to find a common shared story that all of us who want to be in the community will adopt. Anyone who's ever been to a strategic planning to come up with mission, vision, and values knows how hard this is, because everybody's got, no, the story needs to be this. Let's say, the story needs to be this. But we unite as a community when we share the story. And I would submit that these stories we find in the Bible, these themes we find in the Bible, are about the best tool we have to create a shared story. Why? Because there's 1 billion people on the planet right now that know these stories. It's hard to create a shared story if you don't have the same reference. You don't know the same stories. Oh, I saw this movie, I read this book, but only a few people read this book. But not everybody, but most people in our culture know a little bit about the Bible. So it's a shared resource to conduct a shared story. And I think that's its value. But then you might ask, okay, so we could have a shared, and a shared community could be something like this congregation, but it could also be, our city, our state, our nation. I think that's a problem we're struggling with now, is we don't all have the same story about who we are as a community, however you define the community. But if the story comes from the Bible, does that mean it's a story that can only be shared by the Judeo-Christian tradition, only by, what about the people that are born Hindus or Muslims or Buddhist? Well, I'm going to go back to a little bit the talk I gave about Christianity, in that my take is that Christianity at its noblest and purest is universalistic. Even in the Hebrew Bible, you've got a version of it that says a particular tribe is the chosen people, they're the holy ones, everyone else is a Gentile. But you've also got a story that says these people are a light unto the Gentiles, that it's to be a shared, the circle is to be expanded to include everybody. And I share this with another of my favorite authors, Hans Kung, who's a German Catholic bishop that writes a lot about Christianity. He says you can draw the Christian circle wide enough to include all these other people, because there's nothing in the Christian story that has to be exclusivistic. I mean, there's a way to tell the story exclusivistically, but is that drawing the widest story? Can't all people tap into these stories about liberation from bondage, about return from exile, about being purified when you feel unclean? And can't that be told through Hindu traditions? Can't that be told through, can't we unite around those themes without having to argue about, whose book is better than someone else's book? So that's I guess it's good to dream big. That's very ambitious, but I would think that some of these truths and techniques of meaning making that we get from a serious study of the Bible could help us create a human family that has a story that's inclusive enough to draw us all in, and has enough meaning to make us all feel a shared purpose. And so I would like to invite you to take these thoughts into a time of meditation. So I don't know if we've got any background music. I can do it with or without, but just allow yourself to just release the thoughts that have been coming up in your mind as you've been encountering these words and these concepts, and focus the attention on the breath. And just notice without judgment how the breath enters and rest and exits. And notice that the still point in between we feel as the heart, as the center of compassion and love. And so I invite you to direct your energy to the heart and to feel your breath as if it is the heart breathing. As the heart is breathing in love and breathing out compassion. And from that heart-centered space, allow space to arise out of the clearing, the mirror, the empty mirror, the empty space, feelings of times when you have felt in bondage and needing to be liberated, in times when you have exulted in the feeling of having been liberated from bondage. Think about times when you have felt in exile from your home, alienated, estranged, homeless. Think about times when you have felt that feeling of homecoming, of return, of embrace, of acceptance. Think about times when you have felt unworthy, not okay, impure. Think about times that you have witnessed that transformation, that sanctification, when you realize that you are cleansed and whole and healthy and complete. And just allow these memories to rest poignantly in the silence.